Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're situated here today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Thank you so much to everyone for being here today. Thank you, Jean-Sébastien, Rob, and the school for supporting this talk through the seminar series. And it's an absolute honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Vikki Krane. So Dr. Krane is a professor in sport management and kinesiology at Bowling Green State University. They also hold affiliations with the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and American Culture Studies programs and serve as the faculty advocate for belonging and inclusion in the College of Education and Human Development at Bowling Green State. So Dr. Krane, for their entire career, 35 years, has been a barrier-breaking scholar whose work on gender and sexuality in sport has profoundly influenced, and I will say disrupted, the discipline of sports psychology. Dr. Krane has made significant contributions to academic literature and community. There's way too many to name today, so I'll highlight just a few. So recent contributions include their influential edited book, Sex, Gender, and Sexuality in Sport, Queer Inquiries, published in 2019. If anyone wants a copy, I've got one in my office. They also have a forthcoming book in the fall of 2025, stay tuned, called Reimagining the Gendering of Sport. It's going to be awesome, 26 chapters, look out for it. Notably, they've also been a leading voice in advocating for queer inclusion in sport and have played a pivotal role in establishing the social justice through Sport and Exercise Psychology Symposium. So Dr. Krane's expertise has been recognized in many ways. I'll highlight a few ways today. Their excellence in teaching and mentorship was recognized with the title of Professor of Teaching Excellence by Bowling Green State University. And not that long ago in 2023, their alma mater, the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, honored them with the Distinguished Alumni Award for their national and international contributions to the field. So I came to know Vikki through their work before we met in person, much before we met in person, actually. And in particular, I have a very vivid memory as a master's student, maybe a core memory, as the kids like to say, of finding Vikki's work on lesbians in sport, which they began publishing in the 1990s and early 2000s, much before writing about queerness was commonplace and even accepted in sports psychology and other disciplines. And the stories in that work of Vikki's made me realize at the time, as a student, that there's a place and voice for queer people in sport. It's also thanks to Vikki and their colleagues and all those that came before them that there's a place in the academy and sports psychology for queer students and early career scholars, not only to survive, but to thrive with their work. So fast forward years later to last year, I had the chance to write a book chapter with Vikki for their new book. And I remember getting the email invitation. My grad students are just going to laugh at me, slightly embarrassed. And I ran to the kitchen to Carolyn, blanched, so excited and panicked, and said, guess what happened? Vikki Krane invited me to write a book chapter with them. So finally got past the excitement and the panic. And the writing of this chapter with Vikki taught me about collaboration in its most generous and transformative form, and about the kind of mentorship that not only lifts you up well, but also challenges you to be better and, even more importantly, bolder. So while Dr. Krane's work has been instrumental to inclusion throughout their entire career, their talk today is even more timely in the shifting tides of our current political landscape. So needless to say, I'm quite thrilled and jazzed that Dr. Krane graciously agreed to join us today. They're retiring this year, so we're exceptionally lucky to be able to hear from them and the mark they are and will continue to leave on so many. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Vikki Krane, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. That was lovely. Oh, I don't know if I can live up to that introduction. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Erica, for organizing this. Thank you for Department of Kinesiology for having me here. I'm thrilled to kind of share some of my ideas in progress, thoughts of the current moment, and a little bit of research science thrown in there as well. As you know, we're in this interesting moment in women's sport. That works. We are seeing record-breaking attendance record-breaking incomes. We're seeing new leagues getting attention like never before, media attention like we've never seen. We are in a moment, right? This is going to be audience participation, right? So all of this is like going on and all these great things are happening and people are all stoked about women's sport. And we also have this whole movement on protect girls and women, save women's sport. It's like, wait a minute, you love us. Why are you saving us? But we've got these two dynamics going on. And one of the things that I've seen is people who have been longtime staunch supporters of women's sport are very anti-trans in some of their work. And it's really kind of a conundrum. I mean, it's not hard to figure out, but there's this kind of paradox going on. So I want to kind of talk about how a little bit what we know in terms of trans athletes, how we got to this place. And I'm going to share some of my thoughts on what I think some of the motivation behind this is. We'll get there. You can switch out. It's not about locker rooms. It's not about sport, just as it was never about water fountains. There's a lot more to the anti-trans movement that we're seeing. And I'm going to just say, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a little US-centric since that's where my experiences are. And I'm going to guess that examples that I use, you all probably can come up with similar examples from Canada. It's more than sport. The anti-trans venom that's out there, it's policing women. It's maintaining a particular gender order. It's bodily and medical autonomy. It's an attack on freedom of expression, an attack on education and free speech, racial justice, LGBTQ rights. That's a lot. Okay, I'm not going to be able to go into all of those in depth, needless to say. Keep that in mind as we're going through, because I'm going to start out talking more about what we know about trans athletes in sport and circle back to kind of the political background to it. So in the current moment, people's complaints around trans athletes, the reasons why we have to save women's sport, tend to fit into these three categories. We're concerns that there's going to be a trans takeover of women's sport, concerns that the locker rooms are going to become unsafe, and concerns surrounding testosterone and fairness that are all going to be at the detriment of cisgender female athletes. And I'll talk about each of these one by one. So some examples from the United States. Trans athletes have been participating in sport. Nobody really paid any attention until we started seeing them winning. So in Connecticut, this was probably right around 2019-ish. Terry Miller, Andrea Yearwood were high school sprinters that happened to start winning a few races. Both were transgender females competing in the women's side. And they actually were sued for taking positions, taking opportunities away from cisgender athletes. The suit ultimately was kind of tossed out, but again, they were winning, so that was part of the concern. Leah Thomas is a University of Pennsylvania swimmer, and she started winning. All of a sudden, these kinds of examples led some people to go, whoa, trans people are taking over women's sport. Okay, I'm just going to be a little snarky, bear with me. How many of you paid attention to Ivy League swimming? Nobody cared about Ivy League swimming until, oh, there's a transgender person that's winning and taking opportunities away from other people. We'll revisit a little bit of what she's accomplished later on. But as soon as the trans people became visible and started winning, that's where other folks started getting concerned. The reality is, approximately 1.6% of the US population, probably the Canadian population, are transgender. That's not a lot of people. Mullen and colleagues were able to do this really interesting study with NCAA, US college athletes, and they had a pretty large sample relative to typical quantitative studies, and they were able to extrapolate that roughly 1.6% of NCAA athletes identify as trans and non-binary. Even if they wanted to, they were not going to take over women's sport. The reality is that there are going to be some exceptional trans athletes. There are exceptional cisgender athletes. But most of us are pretty average. Most athletes are kind of, they're good, they're elite athletes, but they're not necessarily winning. And the same happens with trans athletes. Some win, some don't. We can also look at the so-called takeover historically. In 2004, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, adopted the Stockholm Consensus, and this provided a policy that allowed transgender participation in sport. In 2011, the NCAA adopted a policy that allowed transgender participation in sport. How many transgender athletes can you name? Okay, you're not going to answer me, are you? Feel free to answer my questions. Since 2011, Outsports.com, which is a LGBTQ sport media site, identified 45 openly transgender athletes in college sport since 2011. Again, beware of that takeover. In 2024, last year, less than 10 openly transgender athletes were competing in the NCAA out of 5,100,000 athletes. Yeah, trans athletes are not going to take over. Again, the numbers are small. That said, of the 510,000 athletes, that percentage comes out to about 8,600 athletes identify as trans and non-binary. While on one hand, I'm saying it's a small population that we shouldn't be concerned about them, we shouldn't be concerned about the cisgenders' fear around them. I do feel like we need to be concerned and take care of, make sure those 8,600 athletes are supported, welcomed, and taken care of. So I'm not trying to belittle the people that are there, but I'm also trying to acknowledge that the numbers are relatively small. There's not going to be a takeover. There's also concerns about what's going to happen in the locker room if we allow trans females into the locker room. There's a group called Champion Women. Nancy Hogshead-Makar is the leader of this group. She is a lawyer, a former Olympic swimmer, and she has been a staunch supporter of Title IX in the US, which is the law that mandates equal opportunity for males and females in education, which includes sport in our society. And she is very anti-trans in her stance right now. She's very much, save women's sport. And this quote comes right out of a white paper that's on her website. And she talks about biological males, i.e. trans females. So this group of trans females are motivated by a desire to commit sexual offenses, flashing, voyeurism, assault, and rape. And that is why they want to be in locker rooms. I'm sorry, if I was a cis male, that's pretty much telling you you have no control. You are innately programmed to go out and violate women, which none of us are going to believe that. And that obviously having a trans person in the locker room is going to be traumatic for cisgender women. Now, what does the research tell us? The reality is trans athletes talk about locker rooms as very unsafe spaces. If anyone needs protecting, it's not the cisgender athletes. Trans athletes consistently across studies report that they feel unsafe, they encounter surveillance, scrutiny, harassment, and violence in locker rooms. There's a lot of research from youth to adult trans people in sport and exercise that consistently say, if possible, they avoid locker rooms. So when we're talking about who needs protection, it's not necessarily cisgender women in locker rooms. There's several research studies in the US with youth sport. And so this specifically looking at high school, secondary students, typically 15 to 18-ish ages. And consistently, they talk about the LGBTQ across the board, and particularly trans athletes, trans people, talk about avoiding the locker rooms. When high school students are surveyed, consistently they say, the LGBTQ athletes and LGBTQ students say, locker rooms and sports spaces are the least safe spaces on their campuses. And as you can see here, 70% of trans students avoid locker rooms. 45% of non-binary, 43% of LGBTQ. So clearly something is going on that this population of students and athletes do not feel safe in the locker room. So the research is very contrary to what we actually see being put out there. And then there's the fair play argument. Okay, I'm going to ask for an answer on this. Is sport a meritocracy? Is there a level playing field in sport? No, you are educated people. No. Sport is made for, I mean, it's a competitive thing. The elite move on. The best of the best keep winning and moving on. It is not a fair playing field. And then, of course, we also have to ask, when we talk about fair play, fairness for whom? What can you tell me about what you have learned about testosterone? Just yell out, what do we know about testosterone? You don't necessarily have to believe it, but what do we learn? Okay, there's the anabolic steroids. People use it to dope. What else? Aggression. What else? Muscularity, competitiveness, size, strength. Testosterone is what makes males males. The more testosterone you have, the more masculine you are, the more male-like you are. This is the social narrative. What science also tells us is that, well, I'll come back to that, sorry, is that we know that there are women Olympians whose bodies do not process testosterone due to various intersex conditions, and yet they're Olympic athletes, best of the best. There are male athletes competing in the Olympics who have exceptionally low levels of testosterone. But yet the social narrative is testosterone is what makes an athlete great. The higher the testosterone, that gives somebody an advantage. Notice all of these things I've been talking about, we only focus on women's sport. None of this applies to men's sport, because if that's the case, why don't we test men and say, those of you with really high testosterone, that's not fair either. But we don't necessarily do that in sport. So what makes an advantage? If we think about sport, there are so many things that provide someone an advantage. Okay, so people like Shaquille O'Neal, LeBron James, I mean, they're literally like walking brick walls. Michael Phelps, 7-foot arm span. Brittany Griner is 6'9". I'm sorry, it's not fair if I had to play basketball against her. Is that an unfair advantage? Simone Biles is 4'6". No wonder she can fly in the air the way she does. Okay, she's got a lot of talent, but it helps to be little to do that. So elite athletes, successful athletes' bodies are not normal. There's a reason they're elite, because they are different than the rest of us. But yet, because of the social narrative surrounding testosterone, there's this belief that testosterone is the thing that separates the best from everyone else. And so when females or people in the female category, as they say in sport, people that are competing in women's and girls' sport, if they are perceived to have high levels of testosterone, they are perceived to have an unfair advantage. It's perfectly legal for someone, for example, to have LASIK surgery and improve their eyesight. You can do that in sport. There are lots of things that give people advantages, but this one innate characteristic, or perceived, is what seems to be singled out. Back to Leah Thomas. So Leah Thomas, our Ivy League champion. Roughly same size, 6'1", 160 pounds-ish, very similar to Katie Ledecky. One has one NCAA championship. One has 14 world records. In fact, she has broken world records over 30 times. Who has the unfair advantage? And is it really an unfair advantage? But has anyone questioned Katie Ledecky regarding her sex, her gender? No, she's just an amazing athlete. As soon as we hear, the media hears, the people that are against trans inclusion, as soon as they hear somebody's transgender, then it's not fair for that person to be competing. And very often, they're not the best in the world. I mean, clearly, she is far from the best in the world, Leah Thomas. No, nothing, not to take away from her from what she's done, but all of these things, the concerns about a lot around testosterone, concerns about locker room safety. There's also concerns that trans female athletes are going to be bigger. Okay, there's a lot that happens in the transition, and I am happy to answer questions on all this. I'm kind of flying through a lot of information, so I'm happy to talk about wherever you have questions. But when people transition, trans athletes transition and compete on the women's side, there are lots of changes where they become much more similar to cisgender women. Their size, their shoulders, and their height, that's not going to change, truly. So this has led lots of groups to ban trans athletes, and you can read through this list. Yeah. Pool, chess. Where is the physical, like chess? Does that mean that it's not like somehow males are just naturally more intelligent and it's not fair for them to compete for females? I mean, where are they pool? Like, where is the male advantage there? We're not talking strength. We're not talking size. So all of the arguments for banning trans athletes don't apply to those groups. And yet, it's concerns about fairness that lead to these trans athlete, trans competitive bans. So this takes us to the political climate. We are in a time, obviously, where there is a lot of anti-trans in the news. There are bills and laws and political debates and concerns in sport, out of sport. In 2022, okay, so even a couple of years ago, research showed that 93% of trans youth feared losing gender-affirming medical care. 91% worried about access to bathrooms. 83% worried about being banned from sport. They were right. All of these things are happening today. There are some horrific laws around trans folks in the US right now, in different states and nationally, and in sport. So this conversation, these political conversations have impacts on real people, and we often forget that. Probably not you all in this room, but the broader people, it's like, this is all about fairness. It's like, no, this is all about people. 85% of trans youth report negative impact of politics on mental health. There's actually some newer studies that have come out more recently, and we see very similar findings. These trans youth talk about being 73% being angry, 57% being sad, 47% being stressed, 40% being scared, and 33% feeling hopeless over conversations around banning trans people from various aspects of life, including sport. There's research specifically on sport. The trans athlete bans exacerbate the existing disparities in mental health. We already know that young trans people, all trans people, are vulnerable and have disproportionate depression, anxiety, other types of emotional reactions. Now, I don't need to tell you this, but it's always important to say, there is nothing about being trans that leads one to be depressed. Being depressed and anxious is in reaction to the hostile environments that they're in. And clearly, at least in the US, it's become very hostile. And depending on the sport that you're in, there's a lot of hostility toward trans athletes, particularly on the women's side. These bans and the effect of this increase suicide ideation. Suicidality is statistically correlated to, associated with familiarity with the laws. The more young student athletes pay attention to the news, the more depressed, anxious, and suicidal they become. There are very real implications of all of this. So when we talk about who are we being fair to and who are we trying to protect, I'm not on the side that cisgender athletes need to be protected from this thing. What we often don't think about and hear about is that bans on trans athletes affect every female athlete. They increase gender surveillance, increase bodily surveillance, reinforce gender stereotypes. All of these things we're seeing. We are seeing in the news examples of young athletes who have short hair, playing on a girls' team, who are really good, and it is the parents and coaches of the opposing teams that are like, they're not girls. It's either they're boys or they're trans. You need to prove to us that those are really girls. I mean, the reality of proving whether a 10-year-old is a girl or not is like, someone needs to go like, pull down your pants and we need to look. No, I have a colleague whose children are around that age. And she's like, it scares me to death that someone might want to pull down the pants and look at the genitals of my child. We are seeing there are bills that are out there in the US that are proposing that this becomes policy, that all girls have to, or anyone that wants to participate in girls' sport has to go through a medical, which is typical for, for being in sport, but that includes genital inspection. So we can say, yes, that really is a girl. This is insane. So this is going to happen to every girl. This is traumatizing for a lot of girls, and for good reason. And all of this teaches discrimination. So, red herrings and dog whistles. I'm going to circle back. We see that in sport, there's a lot of animus going toward transgender people. We see this in politics. The research supports when trans athletes transition, trans females transition, their strength, their body fat, lots of things that impact sport tend to be very similar to cisgender athletes 1 to 2 years after transition. The research is a little different there. There's some more current research that when they looked at military people, folks in the US, I forget which arm, military, that after 1 to 2 years, the trans females can no longer achieve what they need to achieve to pass the physical tests for the men. So they're no longer meeting that requirement. So they are losing strength. We also see that they tend to, like, sit-ups decline, speed declines, push-ups for some reason they stay better at push-ups than cisgender women at 4 years. Okay. How much do push-ups really impact a lot of sport performances? So there's some the research is kind of a little bit all over the place. What we don't have is really good research on high-level competitive athletes, because one, the population is getting very small. So the research that we have often looks at exercisers, and exercisers, they're not Michael Phelps with a 7-foot wingspan. They're not able to do what Simone Biles does. So I'm not saying that research isn't good, but that's not the population that we should be looking at. So we need more research, clearly. But in general, most of the physiologists, endocrinologists, are more likely to say that there really shouldn't be a concern, including transgender athletes in with cisgender female athletes. So why are we stuck on this? Why is this such a huge issue? I mean, the President of the United States is making statements about sport. Don't get me going. The future is female. 94% of women senior business executives participated in sport. 80% of the Forbes Fortune 500 female executives participated in sport. Sports magic. Sports does amazing things, provides all sorts of learning opportunities, provides all sorts of life lessons. Girls in sport have better school performance, greater social mobility, and eventually higher earnings than girls who are not in sport. Sport is a very powerful learning environment. Women college athletes learn leadership capabilities. There's this wonderful study sponsored by the Women's Sport Foundation. Elizabeth Sherrill and colleagues led this study. And one of the things they conclude is that sport provides a vibrant pipeline to leadership outside of sport. People in sport become leaders in sport, they become community leaders, they become leaders in the profession, in their professions, in business. So sport provides women with a lot of social mobility, a lot of opportunity to do a lot of really cool things. When women's sport gains increased parity with men's sport. It signals social change. I mentioned we are in a moment. Women's sport is getting amazing attention. That's a wonderful thing, but we've been here before. I've been around long enough to have watched this. 1992 Olympics, it was the summer of the women. The US women in the Olympics won gold in softball, basketball, gymnastics, two other sports I'm not going to remember. We are here. Women have made it. They're doing better than the men. And then we forgot about it. 1999, the 99ers, soccer, football fans. The 1999ers was the first time the U.S. won the World Cup, Women's World Cup, and Brandy Chastain, waving her jersey. We are in a moment. Women's sport is here. They put 90,000 people in the Rose Bowl to watch a women's soccer game. We have made it. Yeah, we did for a moment. We have gone up and down and up and down and up and down. Every time the women start to rise, boom, there's a social backlash. Why? Some people are fearing what's happening here. That, oh my gosh, women are becoming equals. Women are gaining corporate power. Women are wielding political clout. And we are upending masculinist structures. There are people that fear that. And I'm not blaming all men. I'm saying this is an institutional thing. It's not necessarily a personal thing. But there are some males out there that don't want to share their privilege, that don't want to see society change, that feel that if other social groups start rising, that's not good for them. That's where I see, at least where I live, this closing in on us. It's not about women's sport. It's not about trans athletes. It's about the gender order. It's trying to maintain a type of society that, why are we seeing in the States this, we can't have inclusion. We can't talk about diversity because there's fears that people other than the people in power are going to start gaining more power. And possibly, in the US, Latinx folks are going to fairly soon be the number one, in terms of numbers, the most populous race in the country. And there's people that don't want to see that happen, don't want to hand over power. And that's where we're seeing a lot of this backlash. Again, it's not about bathrooms and locker rooms. It's not about sport. Chris Mosier just yesterday, I think it was, might have been the day before, if any of you follow him, he is a trans male Olympic duathlete, international level duathlete. I'm not sure, has he played in the Olympics? Anyone know? So he was an Olympic, thank you. He was in the Olympics also. And he has been a staunch advocate for trans inclusion in sport. And he has a site called transathlete.com. And he put out basically a rant that this is not about trans athletes. And he went through a lot of these things. And from his perspective of that, this is all about the social order. There are lots of things underlying. And what they're doing, though, is going after an already vulnerable group. Now, when we think of sport, clearly, I don't think any of you will deny this, male sport has a lot more power and privilege than female sport. So if we are asking the males, the women to fight for more power, and there's these trans athletes, they have created an environment where we are fighting infighting, rather than all of us saying, no, I'm just going to be very US centric. It is football that's the problem. It is not the trans athletes that's the problem. If we truly want to protect women's sport, it's not getting the trans athletes out of sport. That is the least of our problems. We need to eradicate sexual predators, fire emotionally abusive coaches. Larry Nassar was allowed to continue in women's sports 20 years after the first accusation of sexual assault. And he sexually assaulted hundreds. We hear mostly of the gymnasts, but other college athletes as well. The NWSL had a recent couple of years ago report that identified the emotionally and sexually, the sexual misconduct and the emotional abuse by coaches, some of whom who also coached at the youth level. They need to get out. That's more of a concern. We can increase funding, media, and marketing of women's sport. One of the things that drives me nuts, well, women's sports doesn't make as much money as men. So at my university, there have been times where the women have been doing really well and they actually get larger crowds than the men. But they don't get the marketing. They don't charge the same as the men. And they're like, look, you don't make as much money. Well, the system is stacked against them. They're never going to make as much money. So there's lots of things we can do to support, protect women's sport. We can provide equal opportunity for boys and girls, men and women. We can stop sexualizing, objectifying, and feminizing female athletes in the media and elsewhere in marketing. We need to listen to girls and women. I do this thing in my class. I was going to make some of you come up here and do this, but I'll just tell you about it. We do this thing in my class that I catch them when they're just not really paying attention a whole lot. And let's talk communication. And I teach in a sport management program. So I'm like, I need 3 guys. And I pick 3 guys that are sitting together. And I'm like, you are going to have a conversation out loud. Your job is, we are tasking you with picking out new uniforms for the women's soccer team. And you need to decide what color the uniform should be. Have that conversation. And so they kind of look at me like, why? What? And they have the conversation and they're talking and they come up with, our school colors are brown and orange. They're like, brown shorts, orange shorts. And they're like, what about home games? Oh, white shorts. Oh, everybody wears white shorts home games. And then like 3 women. And I have a lot of former athletes in my classes. And I'm like, you have that same conversation. They're all like, we don't want white shorts. No, we can't have white shorts. We want brown shorts for home games. Why? Menstruation. The boys don't think about that. And that's fine. But no, you need the women at the table. You need to talk to the people living that circumstance. That's why women have had to wear white shorts, white tennis uniforms forever, because they're not the ones that had a voice in the decision. We need to fight racism, homonegativism, ableism, and pictureism. That will make sport safer for girls and women. And we need to question the binary. Okay, I'm just throwing that out there. It's a huge topic. I could speak for days on that alone. But there is not one single way to organize sport, yet that's what we've done. So let's get creative. Let's come up with new ways. Let's think about it. I mean, the Paralympics I'm not saying these are perfect, but the Paralympics has a different way of organizing who competes in what categories. We're seeing mixed gender sport coming up. There are weight classes in some sport. It doesn't have to be based on separate the boys and girls. So lots of things to think about in protecting girls and women's sport. Trans doesn't come up on this. And what's at stake? And this is where it's like, this is serious. These are people. These are real people we are harming. We are taking an already vulnerable group and imposing more difficulties. Think of all the things we learn through sport, all the benefits of sport. People gain mental health. They gain physical health. They gain emotional balance. It's a stress relief. We learn social skills. We have now taken those away from kids as young as 5, 6, 7 years old. And what we see, the literature tells us, is when people are in a dire, toxic environment, they're going to have more mental health concerns. And yes, they might commit suicide. The research also tells us when a person, I'm thinking like college athlete, younger athlete, when a trans athlete or queer athlete has one supportive adult in their world, it changes it for the better. My advice is always be that person. All they need is one supportive adult to change that toxic world and say there's hope. That's not a hard thing for us to do. And to not do that, I mean, the alternative is dire. So here are some sites that offer information about trans athletes. They are all advocacy sites specifically focused on queer and trans athletes and provides lots and lots of information if you want additional sources. I'm going to open it up at this point. I threw a lot of information at you fairly quickly, so I am happy to answer questions and take this conversation wherever you'd like to go. Thank you. Oh, way back.
Hi, I had a question about how we can be better advocates for people. I think it's really scary having these conversations, especially if it's someone who's maybe resistant. Do you have any advice on what you can say or ways to approach it?
Oh, that's a really tough one. You had to start out with a hard question. I mean, on one hand, part of it is you kind of have to gauge the person in front of you. I mean, there are some people I've talked to, like, they are not changing their minds. And that's where I go to, this is a person that we need to take care of. So try to like tug on the heartstrings a little bit. But I also think, know your facts a little bit. I mean, some of these sites have really good information so to help us talk about trans athletes. The literature shows us that trans females don't maintain this huge physical advantage. Okay, yes, they might be taller. So the high school sprinters were taller than some of the cisgender runners, but Brittany Griner is 6'9". She's not trans, she's not intersex, she's just tall. It's going to happen in sport. So I think if we can talk to them and try to at least have support for what you're saying, try to be more matter of fact. It's really easy to get emotional. And, I think there's also a level of, in some cases, oh, well, you're in the Ivy Tower. What do you know about real life? So being kind of matter of fact about what we're talking about, and know your audience. If we're talking, for example, working with high school athletes and you're going into a group of parents, we can educate them. We can provide information that maybe if you understood some of this or you had these talking points, it might help lead us in a direction. So part of it is meet them in the middle. And then kind of little by little, you can work with them. There's other sources that are going to be much better than what I'm coming up with off the top of my head on that. Thank you. Yes.
The primary conversation revolves around trans women, but I was wondering what your thoughts are on trans men in sport, especially contact sports, especially as well, because that's again a common talking point within people that are anti-trans in sport.
It's kind of interesting. Okay, well, if a trans male and they're smaller, they might get beat up and hurt. Nobody cares about the small cis male. They get beat up too. I mean, think about like middle school football. You've got, kids that are 300 pounds and kids that are 70 pounds, but yet we throw them on a team together. Generally speaking, we don't hear a lot about trans males because the assumption, it's very sexist. The assumption is if they start out as females, they're never going to be a good athlete. They're already starting out at a disadvantage. So fine, if they can keep up, they can come. And once there, again, we see, we tend not to hear a lot about the trans males because they're not necessarily winning. I'm not saying they can't and they won't, but if you're looking at less competitive sport, at elite levels, yeah, they do the training to get there. At less competitive, like high school level, it takes a while to catch up. We had I did a case study on an athlete. I had a former student who was just in the right place at the right time, and she was able to follow a trans male athlete for 1 year, literally right when he started testosterone therapy. And so she did an interview with him once a month throughout, and he kept a video diary, and we have all this really rich data, and this is published. And he talked about, he was a runner, and he talked about transitioning from the women's team to the men's team. Socially, the people were fabulous. Everybody was supportive, and that was a wonderful environment for him. But going from what he was doing as the top female on the team to then, once you start T, there's this expectation coming from the doping literature, give you a drop of testosterone and boom, you're going to start getting better. The NCAA and the Olympic rules used to be the minute a trans male started testosterone, they could only compete on the men's side. Well, after a year of training, and he described it as, think back to puberty. Remember how much we slept during that time? Your body is going through lots of transitions. There's lots of things changing that you have to get used to. And he said, and add Division I, the highest college level training on top of that. So his training, he was up and down and up and down and up and down. And he actually ultimately ended up quitting before his 4 years were up, his eligibility was up, because being a distance runner, he really wanted to have a more masculine body, and being a distance runner, he wasn't able to develop the muscles that he wanted that was going to make him feel good about his body. So for him, he ended up just not staying in sport. And I do think some of it was going from being the best to like struggling to keep up at times. We also see Skylar, help me out, the trans swimmer at Harvard. Skylar, anyhow, there was a trans swimmer at Harvard that was recruited for the women's team, but transitioned before he got there and ended up competing on the men's team. And he actually, over the 4 years, he continued for 4 years and kind of stepped up to, again, not great, but was, competitive and competing in races. So we don't hear a lot about trans men, largely because either they're not winning or the assumption that they're no threat to the current gender order in sport.
Thank you.
As you can tell, I can talk on and on about these things. Andrea.
Thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating. You bring together, like, these are all connected, like that thread that the attacks on trans athletes are attacks on women's sport. And this kind of gets back to like the earlier strategy. I mean, one moment I know where I kind of freeze in my response, so I'd love to hear, is the summer during the Olympics with the two women who, a lot of just really ugly statements being made. We have had instances here in BC of young girls, very young girls, who are exactly what you said, parents on another team, or just like people at the park kind of, made a statement, you need to check their gender identity. And where I struggle is just how to come to those girls' defenses, but in a way that still demonstrates allyship and support for trans athletes, right? That doesn't just go, they're real girls, in a way that would suggest that I am not also supportive of trans girls in these spaces.
Good question. It's hard because you're right. I mean, as soon as you support one or the other, the assumption is that you're the opposite. Like, if I'm going to support the cisgender girls, where are the trans girls? I mean, I think getting back to that, let's just support anyone in girls and women's sport deserves support. They can have short hair. They can be good. I think one of the things that we see is all of this is really putting a ceiling on female performance in sport. As soon as you get too good, oh my gosh, you're a boxer with male-like strength. You must not belong in this category. And that's what happened. She just had the boxer from Algeria just had an amazingly strong punch. And what's the first response? You're trans, you're not fair. I mean, where did that even come from? So we have this in the air now, this assumption that anybody who's too good on women's sports should not be there. I mean, go back to the gender testing. I mean, this is what the World Athletics is doing now. They're now going back to chromosomal testing, which we know didn't work. They did that for a decade in Olympic sport. That we know that there are XY females. We know that there are some females whose bodies don't process testosterone. We know that there's all these things out there, but they want to go back, and we have to have a way to determine who's appropriate in this. And it's all going after you're too good. So part of this is voicing your support for women's sport as a whole, potentially. Like, look, you deserve to be, you're a girl, you identify as a girl, you should be identified and talked to and appreciated as a really good girl athlete. But on this side, there is nothing wrong with being a trans girl. We support and protect you too. But you might have to just voice both sides of it as you're talking because of the assumptions people make. And there's nothing wrong with supporting the cisgender girls. I mean, of course there's not. But at the same time, that perception of what's wrong over here, it's like there is, honestly, why not anyone who wants to compete on the women's side gets to compete on the women's side? Why is that so problematic? And if I'm going to support anybody who wants to be on this team, we should be able to do that. So trying to come up with the language that you mentioned both sides. I support people whose this is their gender identity. Well, this is their gender identity. So we should be able to say both sides are just as important and just as involved. And notice we're talking the extremes here. So when we put this all on a continuum, those kind of average athletes and average looking girls, nobody cares about them. There's also, and I didn't get into this, and I could if you want me to, but there's a racial component to it. There's a sexuality component to it. I mean, it used to be like, oh, you're a lesbian, you don't belong. And now it's you're trans, you don't belong. And if you're not feminine enough, and people of color are perceived to not be feminine. So to be a dark-skinned woman with a really strong hit in boxing, ooh, that was a double whammy of like, you really don't belong here. So talking about, it doesn't matter what they look like. They, you know, they're on this team. Everybody has followed whatever rules. And for example, Leah Thomas followed every single rule out there. She did what the NCAA said she needed to do to be eligible for women's sport, and still got all that backlash. So, but I think it's hugely important to speak out, though. I think, and we talked about this, I was meeting with a group of students earlier, visibility, talking points, saying things, speaking up, all of those things are really important. If you're in a group of parents, for example, that are complaining about, you know, it's not fair that we're playing that team that has a trans athlete, say something, speak up. People assume silence means I agree with you. Silence means complicity in a lot of situations. And even if you don't have the right words, you're actually better to kind of bumble through something and get the point out there. And I know that's hard. We're academics. We don't like to bumble. But at the same time, if we stay silent, even if you're supportive, nobody knows you're supportive. So speak out. Absolutely. There you go.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. Thanks so much, Vikki. So I was remarking or thinking about what you were talking about, the current political climate in the States and by extension, someone in Canada as well. And of course, a lot of pulling of funding for any research that has to do with DEI initiatives, so on and so forth. So thinking 10, 20 years down the line, I'm wondering what your thoughts are, because as academics, we're trained to draw on evidence and research to make our arguments. And we already know that we have such little research pertaining to the experiences of trans, non-binary athletes. And when we're trying to make our evidence-informed claims and be factual so that we can have discussion dialogue, it's already difficult to do so and point to evidence by what we consider to be evidence. So where do you see things going forward? And I mean, I know this is a really hard question.
It is.
Not sure there's an answer to it, but it's quite concerning.
I mean, at the moment, this kind of research won't get funded in the States through federal funding grants. So partnering with other groups is certainly one avenue. There's a research group out of Loughborough in the UK that's doing a lot of work. I think we're going to see it in places other than right here, hopefully. Again, it's really hard to do this research, again, to find the numbers of people to have an acceptable and participant size to do the statistics and to get it published. But I think we need to get creative in getting research with small numbers out there, but also in how we present the work. I hate to say it, but, you know, watch your titles. If you are concerned about the funding, obviously you're not going to ask for research to study trans athletes, but you might be able to come up with something to study something about sport more generally. That might be one thing. But I think more importantly, get involved politically, speak out. Do what you can to change the political climate. I mean, I'm in the States and yeah, things have changed like practically overnight and things are flying at us so fast and we're feeling a bit helpless. At the same time, I have connections with various people and organizations that are like, here are some things that you can do in your busy life. So some people can get out there and do some really huge things politically and go door to door or whatever it takes. And others, it's like, I can make 5 phone calls a day. I can send emails to my immediate politicians. Work locally. a lot of what happens, a lot of in the States, a lot of the political change started locally and then to get going bigger and bigger and bigger. And it took a long time for that change, but do the battle locally. And, you know, let's talk about my school board or my school district and what can we do to be supportive, and try to bring in, and maybe you can do, you know, partner with, you know, high schools, colleges that aren't connected to federal funding. Well, I know they are connected, but some way that you can do the research without the federal funding. I don't have a great answer for that, but I think we're going to need, as academics, and again, particularly in the States today, go Harvard. We need to speak up. We need to stand up. We need to do what we need to do to support our students and our faculties. And I'm not going to say that's easy. And there's risk that comes with that. So I see why, I mean, Harvard just lost billions of dollars. Harvard can afford it. That would, you know, bankrupt my university. So I get that. And I mean, I've even involved in some things where for myself, I'm less worried about speaking out. But if I'm connected with a group that there's vulnerable people in this group, I can't be that vocal. So trying to balance all that, yeah, it's not easy. It's something I struggle with, trying to find ways to effectively work with the broken system. Y'all are asking challenging but very good questions. I mean, seriously, I think we all need to just sit back and think about this. I mean, we need to develop strategies. We need to think about how do we maintain inclusion, maintain some semblance of competitive sport. And I'm in the mindset, it doesn't need to keep looking like it looks like. And maybe you let mainstream sport go on and we create another separate sport entity. Again, I talked about this earlier. Look at the unrivaled league in women's basketball. 3-on-3 basketball they're giving the best salaries in women's sport. They have largely women and minority owned teams. They have lots of money and they're getting huge attendance and media and TV crowds. So it can work. You get outside the box and come up with like, what can we do different? And how do we make that work? And they're the perfect example of like, we're doing our own thing and look at us, we're taking off.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Vikki, for joining us, for your talk, for your time, energy. Thanks everyone for being here, and have a wonderful long weekend.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.